All right, so welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for Woven Threads, conversations about connecting and community in Calgary, Chinatown, which is presented by the New Gallery and moderated by Su-Ying Strang. And just a few brief housekeeping notes before I pass it over to Sue. So just bear with me if you were joined for our previous session, as I know you'll have seen all this before, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. So I'll just share my screen. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Griffin Art Projects is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Stolo nations, and we are honored and grateful to undertake our work here. If you're just joining us now and you would like to enable live captions throughout this presentation, you can enable this by selecting the CC live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And it's not perfectly accurate, but we do hope it will be helpful in capturing most of what we are saying. I also wanted to mention that if you have any audio or technical difficulties with Zoom throughout this presentation, that we'll be live streaming this event on Griffin's Facebook page as well. And I'll drop a link in the chat for easy access in just a moment. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that we will have time for questions at the end of the talk. So feel free at any point throughout the presentation to type your questions into the Q&A dialog box, which you'll notice is actually just separate from the chat box. And we'll be checking back there at the end of the presentation. And there'll also be the option for audience members to ask their questions out loud. So if you'd like to do that, you can feel free to indicate that in the Q&A or just raise a virtual hand with the button at the bottom of your screen and I'll be able to unmute you. So thank you so much everyone again for joining us. And I will now pass it over to Su-Ying Strang, who is a conference partner and the director of the New Gallery.
Hi again, everyone, and thank you for that, Jazz. I'm excited to introduce and be in conversation with the three artists participating in the Calgary Chinatown Artist Residency this afternoon. Before we get started, I do want to share that I'm joining from Mokinstis, which is the Blackfoot name for this place we also call Calgary. And on behalf of the New Gallery, I'd like to express our gratitude for living, learning, and growing on this land. The New Gallery acknowledges our home on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region, including the Niitsitapi, or Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Kainai, Piikani, and Siksika First Nations, Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, which is comprised of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I'd also like to acknowledge the many other First Nations, Métis and Inuit, who call this land home. For those of you who weren't in attendance of the opening panel yesterday, the New Gallery is a charitable artist-run center that was established in 1975 as the Clouds and Water Gallery and Visual Production Society. We support the research, creation, and exhibition of socially relevant and politically informed creative practices from artists at all junctures of their careers. Our programming comprises a broad range of art and educational activities, including exhibitions, publications, residencies, and community collaborations. Outreach and collaborative programming in Calgary Chinatown has been a growing aspect of the New Gallery's work over the last 5 years, and yesterday I gave an overview of how the New Gallery began working with and in relation to Calgary Chinatown. This ongoing commitment to outreach in Calgary Chinatown was integral groundwork leading up to the Calgary Chinatown Artist Residency. This project is a collaboration with the City of Calgary Public Art Program and has been in the works over the past 2 years after Public Art was approached by the city's Culture Department about an opportunity to engage artists during the current cultural and planning process for Calgary Chinatown. In 2016, a 3-tower development was proposed for an empty parking lot in the neighborhood, which asked for a relaxing of restrictions to double the current building restriction height of 15 stories, as outlined in the community's 30-plus-year-old area redevelopment plan. This project was not heavily advertised and the community was not adequately consulted. Once folks became aware and word spread, the community came together organizing to push back against the approval of this project's ask, which could have been damaging to the community's future. This is a thematic that's come up numerous times over the weekend across Canada's Chinatowns. In the years that followed, the community said, we need future development and redevelopment to be done in consultation with us. Eventually, thanks to the advocacy of this community, the relaxation of building height restrictions was successfully repealed, and the developer has since pulled the project. This event was, in part, a catalyst for the community coming together to work with City to determine a path forward for Calgary Chinatown, looking at that 30-year-old plan. And as Chinatowns all over North America change in their use, their populations, their businesses, their built environment, they're at risk of disappearing if long-term visioning and planning for these communities does not take place. The city is committed to undertaking a project called Tomorrow's Chinatown, which includes developing a cultural plan alongside a new local area plan in consultation with the community of Calgary Chinatown. These documents will define the collective vision for the neighborhood and identify planning priorities before any future developments in this community. To return to the residency, this project was an opportunity for artists to research and develop a new work in relation to Calgary Chinatown over a 3-month period. A peer jury selected Theresa Tam from Calgary, Manny Wong from Toronto, and Wing Wong from New York City. There are 3 main objectives of this residency: to engage with the community of Calgary Chinatown, to focus their artistic research on the past, present, and potential futures of Calgary Chinatown, and finally, to develop a new body of work that responds to this research. This residency is a standalone project, but runs parallel to the city's Tomorrow's Chinatown project. One particularly compelling opportunity that I see within this residency is the potential for these artists to be advocates for and conduits of additional insights gained from their ongoing outreach in the community. Using an artist-centered lens while expanding the ways in which community engagement takes place may help highlight information not captured through the city's typical engagement and consultation methodologies. In advance of the residency, the 3 artists participated in a programmed week of activities and conversations by way of introduction to the neighborhood and began to familiarize themselves with the historical and current socio-political context of Calgary Chinatown. We undertook 30+ programs over the course of 5 days. This programming aimed to include a broad intersection of different voices to highlight the many simultaneous truths and histories that Calgary Chinatown holds. We had presentations from academics and city staff on heritage, history, planning, and culture. We had conversations over meals at some of the wonderful restaurants in the neighborhood, joined by community members of past and present. We learned stone chop carving with Stephen Kwok. We had discussions with small business owners and learned about their histories, ideas, and aspirations. We visited many of the tongs and associations with I Love YYC Chinatown. We made and ate dumplings with community elders. We toured the Cultural Center and learned its important history and grounding role in the community with Tony Wong. We listened to the Cantonese opera rehearsals at our next door neighbor's place, the Calgary Harmony of Arts Association, and so much more. Of course, as we began stage 2, the actual residency, where the artists returned to live and work in Calgary Chinatown, COVID-19 hit, and we had to postpone the start of Annie and Theresa's residency. The pandemic also interrupted the middle of Cheryl's residency, as she had started her program 2 months earlier. During the postponement, the artists have continued long-distance research and project development, and due to the ongoing disruptions of the pandemic, we've collectively decided to resume the residency long-distance for our out-of-town artists starting next month in May 2021. I'd like to express all my gratitude to Janet Lavoie and Randy Neeson at the City and the rest of the team at the New Gallery who've collaboratively developed and shaped this program, as well as I Love YYC Chinatown, who not only participated in the program week, but also shared their knowledge and collaborated on developing and piloting components of the program week through one of our prior collaborations. I also want to acknowledge Watershed Plus for inspiring the program week model through their Dynamic Environment Lab Week. And finally, I'd like to thank our 3 wonderful artists for their flexibility and ongoing commitment to this work, as well as their willingness to share their practices with us all today. I'm going to go ahead and provide all 3 bios of the artist at once in order of their presentations, and then we'll dive right into it. As Jazz mentioned, we'll have time for a Q&A at the end, so feel free to add those questions. We'll do them all together after all 3 artists have presented. We'll first hear from Wing Wong, who is an artist and trained architect working at the boundary of art, architecture, and social practice. Cheryl received her BA in Art and Italian at the University of California at Berkeley. She studied sculpture at the Accademia de Belle Arte de Brera and earned her Master of Architecture from Columbia University, GSA-BP. Her work has been exhibited at Triangle Arts Association, the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Istanbul Design Biennial, Usagi Gallery, Los Angeles Center for Digital Art, Taliesin West, the Venice Biennale for Art, BMW Guggenheim Lab, Berkeley Art Museum, Museo della Permanente in Milan, amongst others. Next, we'll hear from Manny Wong, who is a writer and multidisciplinary artist working in the performance and installation. Often collaborative, site-specific, participatory, and process-oriented, Annie's practice explores the intersection of poetic and political of every day. Annie is presented across North America, including the Gardner Museum, Studio XX, Third Space, Open Source Gallery. She's held residencies at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Khyber Center for the Arts, and the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Annie's literary practice includes poetry, art writing, and nonfiction, and Annie also just opened a new exhibition at the New Gallery this weekend. Finally, we'll hear from Theresa Tam. Theresa is a practicing visual artist born and based in Calgary, graduating from the Alberta College of Art and Design in 2014. Theresa's practice utilizes making me laugh. Theresa's practice utilizes making me laugh, familiar spaces and experiences to alter them into something foreign through reinterpreting and recreating. Her projects are developed to include and emphasize visitor interactions. She specializes in digital platforms, functional installations, body-based exchanges, and labor-intensive cooking, which I've had the opportunity to eat on many occasions. Theresa recently exhibited with M Media's Particle and Wave Festival as Quartet in Transit, Stride Gallery, and MST Performative Art. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Cheryl first up for our presentation.
Thanks, Sue, for that intro, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us to present our work. I'm just going to share my screen now and get my presentation started. Can you see a yellow screen? Is that working?
Yep.
Yes. Perfect. So just to start, I'm currently based out of New York City. I live in Lower Manhattan, and I have my studio here in Brooklyn. I'd like to acknowledge that this land is the traditional unceded territory of the Lenape people, and I'd also like to pay respects to Indigenous elders of the past, present, and future who have stewarded this land for generations. So today I'm going to share with you a project I've been developing through the Calgary Chinatown residency. A little bit about my background. As Sue mentioned, I'm an artist and a trained architect, and my creative practice is at this intersection between the two disciplines. In my work, I'm interested in exploring how we share physical space together, how spaces can change over time, but also how community stories and oral histories are connected to architecture. So the project I'll be talking to you about is called Chinatown Reflective Urbanisms. It's an interactive website project that's currently a work in progress. In this project, I'm mapping Calgary Chinatown through its architectural changes, through changes that have occurred in its buildings over the past decades since it was established in 1910, as well as through the stories about the different kinds of activities that took place inside, outside, and around the buildings. So I started the residency a little bit earlier. I started it last year in February and March 2020, and this was just before the pandemic shut down the US-Canada border. I did 2 months of the residency and will be completing the last month of residency this summer. And during this time, I was pretty immersed in Calgary Chinatown. I was staying at a senior living facility, Clover Living, that Sue had spoken about before, in the middle of Chinatown. I was working out of the new gallery in the Canton Block, which is the oldest building in this Chinatown. And I was basically eating, sleeping, walking, shopping Chinatown. In New York City, I live in Manhattan's Chinatown. So it was a really powerful experience for me to deep dive into seeing and listening to Calgary Chinatown and its community. And not just observing, but really feeling and understanding the concerns and subtleties and the incredible legacies to Calgary Chinatown. I spent this time on ground exploring, researching, and piecing together clues on each of these buildings in a couple different ways. The first part of my research was just to observe the buildings by walking around, exploring the buildings, moving around the building, looking at the building details, and documenting the building, photographing it from different perspectives. To me, a building with facade has so much meaning. This is how the building faces the city. It's how it represents itself to the world. There's so much we can tell from the outside of a building. What does it say about who it's catering to, about ownership? How do we go inside? How do we enter the building? How do we look inside it? How do the materials used tell a story about when the building was built? How do ornamental features communicate stories about culture? Is the signage a major feature or just a subtle whisper on the building? And how does the building announce that it's part of Chinatown? However, it's not just about the exterior, it's also about the details of life inside these buildings. These are photographs taken from inside various buildings in Calgary, Chinatown. And the top right photos were taken inside senior facilities. You can see the rounded architectural doorway, which is meant to invite harmony into the space. It's surrounded by Lunar New Year decorations. And the photo on the top, just to the left of that, shows a shrine inside the Calgary Chinese Elderly Citizens Association building, where Chinatown residents can purchase a plot to house and honor deceased family members. This shrine is pretty tucked away on the 3rd floor of the building, above hallways of administrative offices. It's definitely a place you wouldn't be able to find on your own. The other photos show the interior of the Dragon City Mall and some other recreational spaces inside Community Tong Community Association buildings. So by observing the building in its current day state, we can understand a lot. But it's also about piecing together clues on what the building was like before and how the building has changed over time. My process involves looking at old architectural drawings to find the original intentions of the building, or to look for really clear ways in which the building has been modified. Sometimes the floor plans exist and the building stewards were able to dig up old rolls of drawings from their basements to share with me. Other times the Glenbow archives carry filed architectural drawings for buildings. But often with many buildings, there just aren't drawings available. With some buildings, all that remains, if you're lucky, is one old photograph. But again, this can say a lot about the building. And while we can't always understand the 3-dimensional aspects of a building, we can still understand a part of the story by seeing the former footprint of a building. It tells us what was there before. This is a detail from the City of Calgary's 1911 fire insurance maps. You can see that at this time, the city was much more sparse and much less dense. There were a lot more freestanding residential buildings. And if you look closer in the lower center of the map, there's kind of a dense pink and orange row there. This is the Canton Block, which was built in 1910, 1911. This is actually where the new gallery is currently located. And just underneath that, you can see the triangular shaped block. It's the early stages of the Flatiron building. You can also see that 2nd Avenue Southwest used to run all the way through, and this was long before the street was closed off in the late 80s for the Chinese Cultural Center to be built here. So again, super interesting to look at these old maps. So in addition, I also held a few community engagement sessions at the Chinese Cultural Center last winter. We put out an open call and invited anyone and everyone to join, to share their stories or any old photographs they had. We posted these notices in public areas, published them in the local Chinese newspaper, and also simply walked around and handed them out. I'm really grateful for the help I had from Alice Lam. She's one of the founders of the I Love YYC Chinatown group. I'm sure she's already been mentioned in this conference. She introduced me to several of the local associations in the area and has been super amazing at advocating for Chinatown for years. So at these community engagement sessions, we had lots of different folks show up. There were folks from some of the local associations, as well as Chinatown activists who've been involved for decades. And there were also people who had grown up in Calgary Chinatown in the 60s and 70s and have since moved out. So over tea and snacks, community members shared stories and memories about Calgary Chinatown of the past. I also spent time one-on-one with other community members to walk through their buildings together, to conduct interviews and to listen to their stories about their buildings. Several people led the process to construct their building from the ground up, so it was always really interesting to hear about their journeys to bring these pieces of architecture to life. With each interview, I also capture a portrait of the person with their building. And these are portraits of the caretakers, the owners, residents, both former and current, architects and stewards of these Chinatown buildings. So in the next few images, I'm going to show the work in progress of deep diving into one sample building. And this is a building at the intersection of Center Street and 3rd Avenue in Calgary, Chinatown. It's currently the Visions Eye Care Center building. This building was formerly the Linda May Block. It housed Linda May's coffee shop, the gift store, and the Lotus Gardens restaurant. When you see old photographs of Calgary Chinatown back in the 50s and 60s, this is one of the iconic buildings you see the most. With this building, I was introduced to Carol and Jasmine Poon. They're two sisters who grew up in Calgary Chinatown in the residential building just right next door to the Linda May Block. Their grandparents, Chong Him and Arlene Poon, had opened up and owned Linda May's in the early 1950s. And they were really important figures in shaping Calgary Chinatown during this time. Carol and Jasmine shared many amazing photos and stories with me of what it was like to grow up in Calgary Chinatown. And the cool thing about it was that our time together also led to another interview with their aunt, Georgina Poon, who is Chong Him and Arlene's daughter. So Georgina had spent her childhood helping out at the restaurant. In these interviews, Carol, Jasmine, and Georgina shared their memories of what took place in the buildings. And sometimes these interviews would lead to really amazing moments of active drawing and creating artifacts of these memories. During one of our discussions, this sketch that you're looking at was drawn by Carol from her memories of all the time she spent as a child inside Linda May's coffee shop. And this is drawn by someone who has never drawn a floor plan before. She recalled spending afternoons after school at the cafe and helping out in the restaurant. And in drawing out this plan in our discussion, it really triggered memories for her of where the soda fountain was, where the pies were stored, and the booth where she and Jasmine would hang out after school. I did ask Carol what kind of food was served at Linda May's, and here's a quote from her, just in case you guys aren't hungry yet. So here's a quote from Carol. So, in the coffee shop, there was an ice cream machine and booths with jukeboxes. 50s and 60s music played on that jukebox. Here we served pie, coffee, butter horns, pastries, but also sandwiches, turkey, burgers, soups. My dad made lots of pies, banana and coconut cream pie, cherry pie, apple pie. At the time, people smoked indoors. At Linda May's Lotus Garden, they served egg foo young, wonton soup, chicken noodle soup, beef noodle soup, egg rolls, and deep fried shrimp served in rounds like a donut. Sweet and sour ribs, chicken with mushrooms, beef and broccoli, chop suey and chow mein. And that's only an excerpt. I will stop there with that quote. So after gathering research from these buildings, photographs and floor plans, my process involves recreating 3D digital models of the building's iterations and connecting these iterations together to tell a story about how the building has changed over time. In the Reflective Urbanisms website, you'll be able to scroll through the different chapters that are known of, at least, within a building's history. This animation you're seeing shows 5 different digital models that were created of the Linda May Block site. There are 5 major chapters so far within the life of the building. At the beginning, from 1905 to the late 1940s, it was an old generic boarding house. This was purchased by Chong Him and Arlene Poon in the late 1940s. By the early 1950s, Linda May's coffee shop was established. And in 1966, this iconic 3-legged signage right here was built. In the early 1980s, the restaurant changed ownership and it became Mandarin Village Restaurant. And in the late 80s, the building was renovated to be essentially the building we see today. And these renovations were done by architect Clem Lau, who has also worked to renovate several other buildings in Chinatown. So I'm currently working on creating 3D digital models of all the current buildings in Chinatown. Obviously, some buildings have more information on them to piece together the transformations. Other buildings have very little information on their past. But ultimately, the Reflective Urbanisms web project will be a compendium of the building histories, the facade transformations, and stories of the past generations. So I'm going to end by linking this Reflective Urbanisms project to 2 concurrent Chinatown-related projects I've been working on. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have obviously witnessed this huge surge in xenophobic rhetoric about the Chinese virus and the Kung flu, lovingly spearheaded by our disgraced former US President Trump, and a frightening rise in anti-Asian sentiment and violence. And while this kind of racism isn't new, it's been inflamed during this COVID era we're in. And Chinatowns especially have been vulnerable and they've been disproportionately impacted. I think the work that so many people in our communities have been doing around solidarity, around speaking out, and around staying strong is so important. So my goal with these projects that are listed here is to really create a resource for cultivating or simply remembering our own resilience. The first listing you see here is called Musings from Chinatown, Peri-Pandemic Notes on Resilience. It's a digital publication project I'm currently working on, also with the support of the City of Calgary and the New Gallery. It features contributions from New York and Calgary Chinatown community members on how to stay resilient and how to remember the stories of our Chinatowns. It's a bilingual Chinese and English language PDF publication. It will be free for anyone to access. It will likely be launching next month, so you can just check back on my website for the download link. And Jazz will include these links for these projects. So the Musings from Chinatown project is an extension of a conversation I organized earlier this year on the theme of resilience. The resilience talk is the second listing on the slide. It was a discussion between Chinatowns across North America on pandemic relief efforts and the future of Chinatown. It included New York City's Chinatown, Seattle's Chinatown, Calgary Chinatown, and Toronto Chinatown. And you can view a recording of this talk online. And lastly, stay tuned. The Reflective Urbanisms website is being developed. It's expected to be live by late summer this year. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And if you don't mind just pushing the stop share button at the top of your screen.
There we go.
Perfect.
Up next, we have Annie, and I've already read your bio, so you can go ahead and jump right in.
Okay, hi. Oh, here I am. This is the first time that Theresa and Cheryl and I have gone together since November 2019, and so we're learning about each other's projects for the first time, and like, wow, I'm so amazed. I'm so excited to see what Theresa's doing. So anyway, so I'll talk a bit about what I'm doing, but before I do, I want to acknowledge that I am on Toronto, the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. This land is part of Treaty 13 and the District 1 Stream Treatment. And I'm just going to quickly share screen. So I want to begin my discussion about the residency project by first talking about another residency project I did here in Markham, Ontario, with the Laurie Art Gallery. And Markham, Ontario is a Chinese ethnobird. It's developed very late in the historical Chinatowns. And my residency was interested in engaging this community with the question, how does one make a Chinese home? And so the residency began with this pop-up exhibition called How to Make an Inclusive Home, where local Chinese residents lent some of their artwork to the gallery to sort of show what kind of work they were, or the different ways they were making a Chinese home. And I was interested in the practice of making home with these particular types of folk art, and you can see they're all kind of very similar and different. And I was interested in this sort of Chinese articulation of the domestic space, how it's, wittingly or not, a political practice of cultural survival for the Chinese immigrant, and how the machine of self-orientalization and over-identification with the whole nation operates in this way as an aesthetic of nostalgia, as much as an aesthetic of cultural survival in white colonial society. So thinking about these practices in domestic spaces, I was interested in how these translated in public spaces and commercial spaces, in places like Chinatowns. So this is the question that I brought to Calgary during our site visit. And so in November 2019, the three of us spent glorious week learning intensely about the Calgary Chinatown from meeting the elders as Julian earlier described, and it was such a wonderful, generous outpour of community trust and research. And so I just want to share a few learnings that I've taken from that week. And one is the history of the Chinese Cultural Center in particular. The Chinese Cultural Center tells the story of the fight against the proposed area development plan in 1980s, which would displace 40% of the neighborhood with high-rise buildings, eradicating Chinatown's boundaries so the neighborhood would be subsumed by the rest of the downtown core. The tremendous volunteer and community effort to fight the proposal and to preserve the neighborhood saw the community winning significant concessions, including a plot of land where the Chinese Cultural Center currently sits and continues to serve the community. And that is the image on the left, and it's an interior image of the rotunda that is modeled after the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. And on the right is an image of a silk tapestry that are hung in many of the tongs. And the one that you're seeing now is a silk tapestry from the Calgary How Oak Tin Association. And it says on the left from Jingmin Municipal Foreign Affairs Office, Jingmin oversees Chinese Association. And in the middle it says long live friendship, reiterated in English on the top as you can see. And on the right it says to Calgary Ji Hoak Tin Association. What both of these stories tell me is that the aesthetics of Calgary's Chinatown operates to affirm relationships to the homeland, both to the land and to the people, symbolized through the rotunda and this tapestry. And that these relationships, both imaginary and real, play significant roles in the cultural survival of the community. And I should note that the Chinese Cultural Center, much of the fundraising to build that building was from connections back at home. Okay. And so another thing that I learned that resonated with me was that the first Chinatown formed adjacent to the Blackfoot encampments across the Bow River during the late 19th century, and also housed the first Indian Friendship Center from the 1960s through the 90s. The site is currently just an empty lot across from the Cultural Center, where only a solitary ceremonial pone remains. Not much, however, is known about the relationship between the Chinese and the indigenous communities that were in proximity. And this gap of knowledge is perhaps due to the gap of relationships. And in her talk about the Indian Act, Dawn Miracle describes the Indian Act as one among many methods of racial segregation that ensured relationships between settlers and indigenous people were systematically prevented. The reserve system and the formation of Chinatown as a symptom of historic racial ghettotization operates as forms of colonial race management, however governed with very different degrees of autonomy. And so after that week of research, we went back home and with intentions of returning, but of course with the pandemic postponing our residency, other issues also emerged. And most of my attention was the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Regis Korchinski-Paquette here in Toronto during the summer of 2020. These deaths reanimated the Black Lives Matter movement, and my attention immediately turned from an aesthetics of cultural survival to a question of allyship. Responding to the lack of Chinese language anti-racism educational material, I collaborated with Chen Chen, an academic at the University of Alberta and originally from China, to create How to Be a Chinese Ally, an English and Chinese language anti-racism resource. The resource intends to consider what it means to be a Chinese settler and to question our proximity to whiteness by offering intimate conversations with Black and Indigenous artists and friends, as well as translated educational material excerpted from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives, and others. And so While originally intended to be read as a heavily researched text, instead, Chen and I decided that perhaps allyship emerged from learning intimately about the lives of others. And so the project led me to think differently about what the aesthetics of cultural survival could mean to non-white communities. And so and so here I just want to share this cartoon that Jason Lee created to contribute to the resource guide. And it's a very sweet 10-panel comic where he he tells his story about trying to unlearn the implicit bias as a Chinese in the diaspora born in Hong Kong. But another two interviews that really compelled and changed my way of thinking about the residency was an interview with Jay Sterling and Seth Cardinal-Dodginghurst. And so Jay Sterling is the artist of the Black Lives Matter mural that you can see behind him in this image, The Guide and the Protector. And the controversy surrounding this mural begins with its initial site that was slated for downtown Calgary. But when right-wing media discovered that this mural was going up and replacing an older mural, Pink Flamingo, who were the organizers of the mural, received incredible, vicious, violent backlash. And so the project had to be postponed. But then quickly after, they were able to find a new site in Chinatown. After contentions with the community, the mural is now, Chinatown is now home of the mural. And so when I interviewed Jay about his experience with the mural, one thing that really stuck with me was him telling me that he feels safe in Chinatown, and that when he first immigrated here from Jamaica, it was in Chinatown where he would hang out and grab some meats and shoot his music videos. And so I came to realize that the cultural safety lent to Black communities was an incredible important asset in Chinatown that was not necessarily captured in during the research site visit. And another interview that compelled me was with Seth Cardinal-Dodginghurst. And so Seth Seth lost his home on the Tsitsania Reserve, which was sold to the province of Alberta to build the Southwest Calgary Ring Road Highway. And here's an image of him in protest during the opening of that highway, where after an impassioned speech, he cuts his hair. And cutting his hair is an act of mourning to his people. And I'm sure many have seen the footage. And so the image struck me in a number of ways. One, it triggered a memory where Glenna, his mother, told me when we first met that Indigenous people used to call Chinese people in Calgary braids in the front or braids in the back, because the Chinese man used to have a long queue hairstyle, and that Chinese people would call Indigenous people braids in the front. And it also reminded me of an anecdote where if a man overseas during the early immigrations, or the first immigrations, would cut his braid, it meant that he was cutting off his connection to his homeland. And so even though we could never know what it means to be an Indigenous person losing their land, the idea, the connection through the cutting of the hair and the loss of homeland was able to resonate, at least symbolically. I'm going really fast, so that's probably a good thing though, because we're so late. And then another moment of research was after, in I think, what does it say here, January, we were invited to these two city consultations. So as Suying mentioned earlier, our residency is in tandem with the cultural plan for Chinatown. And so during these two consultations, the topics were what new cultural assets and programs does Chinatown need, and also what could a year-round experience look like? And so in both of these conversations, which were held by a white consultancy firm, in both of these conversations, Chinatown was framed as a tourist designation to what I imagine was to attract a white community, and that the deep relationships reflected in the aesthetics of cultural survival in the neighborhood was spoken as if tourist kitsch rather than signs of safety. And so what was really disturbing about this conversation was that this was what was conceived of as the path for the future of the neighborhood. So I should mention that unlike Cheryl, I have not started my residency yet, and I'm still in research. We are to start next month. So in response, and based on my learnings, my residency project, which begins May, hopes to imagine the future of Chinatown as anti-colonial, one in which the neighborhood's history of cultural survival is in the place of cultural safety for a place of cultural safety for non-white communities. The project involves 6 weekly virtual cultural exchange workshops between the Chinese and Indigenous communities to explore what an aesthetics of cultural safety built on relationships between these two communities can look like. Well, some of the workshops will be public. The program will also engage a committee made up of Indigenous and Chinese people, both elders and the younger generation, who will attend the workshops and discuss their learnings throughout the process. And so the goal of this cultural exchange program is to build relationships between the Chinese and the Indigenous communities that were obscured in the past, and to inspire leadership in Chinatown to reimagine the neighborhood as a site of anti-colonial allyship. So that's, how do I cut back here? It's just so weird, it's just I'm talking to a screen. Did I stop? Okay, stop sharing. So that's my project, and then I guess I'll hand it over to Theresa, or hand it back to you.
Theresa's great. Thanks so much, Annie.
Hello, can people hear me? Okay. I hope people can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I am Theresa. I am local to Calgary, so I'll be speaking, I guess, a bit more locally about this residency, and I won't be going too much into my personal history in this presentation, but because I kind of want to leave that for the actual residency. Before I really start, I'm just going to share my screen. People can see my screen okay? I hope. So
yeah, looks
great. All right. So so I'm gonna start off my land acknowledgement based on a collaborative land acknowledgement I did with Stephanie Wong Ken and Ariam Kim in consultation with Marina Crane and Brittany Bearhat. And I want to use that specific land acknowledgement because that is what I'll be focusing on today. So I'm just going to read off of that right now. So so Calgary Chinatown sits on the point of land where the Bow River and Elbow River meet, which continues to nourish life as it has for many millennia for the peoples of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, Stoney Dakota, and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and also the many other Indigenous people who call this area, specifically the Bow River and Elbow River, home. And this is important because Chinatown actually quite literally sits on the point of land where the Bow and the Elbow River meets. So if you ever, or if you are in Calgary or ever come to this area, you will find that you can actually walk in a few minutes away. You can actually find that point. And so it was really important to specify that, especially, I think, because this publication and the actual location of the neighborhood sits on a really important Indigenous land, not just land, but also a, how do I say this? Sorry. It's just really important in terms of how they live life and connect with each other and themselves. And this is also important too because many of our ancestors also have crossed the Pacific to enter through the unceded territories in the West. And so I also want to acknowledge that Chinatowns, we are people of color who uh, were also displaced or pushed out from a lot of our homelands and through also colonial forces and allowed to settle in this country by the colonial state. And so there's a lot of complex colonial forces which allow us to be here and settle, but also at the same time is displacing and also perhaps the reasons why we have to a lot of our ancestors or even ourselves have to move away from from the homes that we ourselves or our families have come from. So with that, I will just quickly go through what I've been doing since the post moment of the residency. And so I have decided to do, well, not decided, but I started up a press with Aaron Kim last year, a risograph press. And one of the projects I proposed to do was to do colonial imports in relation to Chinatown, which we also worked on collaboratively with Stephanie Wong Ken. So last summer we were talking all about how reviews tend to talk about ethnic food kind of in a really tokenistic way. And sometimes they don't actually even talk about the places that we hold dear or consider to be very good or not very good, but like they tend to go to places that white people tend to like or is actually run by white people. So we wanted to start this series called Colonial Imports, which really we just want to talk about the ways colonial forces and the way things and materials and ingredients and people move and the way recipes change over time through colonial forces. And so I thought this would be a good way to start the series off because with Chinatown, there's a lot of rich history around colonialism, but specifically also with bubble tea. So bubble tea is, delicious. It brings young people in, but there's also a lot of talk around bobification or a form of gentrification of Chinatown. And so even though it's kind of like a double-edged sword, so it brings people together, especially youth, but it also perhaps displaces and also takes away some of the history of Chinatown. So I figured it would be a good topic to talk about in terms of for this publication, but also as a interim project between when I finally start the residency and also in what's been happening as well in the past year. So I'm just going to use fun animations. So a lot of, and I'll talk about residency a bit later too. So I'm just gonna just flip through some of the scans of the publication that, which is available right now. We're kind of running a bit low, but it's out in circulation already. And we're in the process of scanning these so that we can be shared publicly in digital form. So here, there's a land acknowledgement, but also a map that is made of current and also past bubble tea locations. And so you see on the left that there is a lot currently for such a small space, but also you can also see that there's also been a few that have been closed already. And a lot of these are based on my memory of what has existed and what continues to exist, and the classifications of bubble tea. So you have ones that you find in Vietnamese restaurants, but also those that have been existing for a really long time, and then also those that are franchises. And so you can see that for just a small, few blocks, there's a large amount of bubble tea shops. And a lot of my contribution in this publication is actually to do this kind of mapping, this kind of research. And so what I'm going to be sharing after this is actually all about the research I had on bubble tea and its history. And this is the beginning. So I'm just gonna move on to the next part. So yes, a lot of my contribution, which was not like I didn't put my name on it, but what I like to really do in my research all the time is I like to research things really in depth in things that are not necessarily academic, but a bit of oral history through forums, through conversations. And so my contribution are in these like pearl of wisdoms and did you knows. And so in this publication, through between different all the different contributors, I interspersed it with interesting, what I consider to be interesting information around bubble tea and the formation of it and how it came to be. And so I'm just going to just highlight some of the things that I thought was interesting through this. And so bubble tea, like the names, like like where did bubble tea come from, and how it came to be. Uh, I'm just going to, let's see, I'm kind of doing a more free-form presentation here today, but let's see, I'm just going to go to the next one because I think this one's actually more interesting in my mind. So there is many names for bubble tea, right? There is, well, I use bubble tea, but you might hear boba tea and you might hear pearl. And so I think this is I find this really interesting because it shows you a confluence of different groups of generations and different people coming from different parts of Asia or even in the country. So pearl milk tea, it tends to be the more traditional the actual terminology of bubble tea. So in Chinese, it's actually translated to be pearl milk tea. And you'll actually find this quite common in most bubble tea shops. Um, but and the term bubble is actually not actually about the pearl itself or the tapioca. It's actually the fact that you have to shake the drink before you, like, once everything's done, you might see that the machine shakes the drink and the bubbles actually the foamy part on top. I haven't figured out why it's called bubble, but it's definitely a like Western term and very likely to be um, as an easy way to identify it versus pearl, because pearl is quite traditional, and the term pearl, which is in Chinese, is specific to tapioca or sago pearls. And so there's a lot of historical and cultural context that is lost. So I'm assuming that the word bubble is to make it more appealing. And my favorite fact, boba is not a transliteration or a nickname for bubble. It's actually apparently comes from a Taiwanese shop who thought that, because at the time in Taiwan, the pearls were actually small. So like the ones you find in dessert soups, like the tiny ones, it used to be that small. And I can confirm this because last year I was in Taiwan before the world shut down. And I went to one of the original bubble tea places. And when you ordered a drink, you actually got the smaller version of pearls. So my friend and I were like, what the hell is this? Anyway, at the time we were like, this is not bubble tea. But then I learned later that that is the OG version. But apparently this guy in Taiwan wanted to like stand out. So he made like a bigger version, like the version that we know now. And he termed it boba because boba is also a slang for like large breasted. So yeah, but I'll let you all sit with that information right now. But I thought that was really interesting. And so I, I still encourage people to continue to say the word boba if they want to say boba, but I hope you understand now where that comes from and are able to share where that terminology comes from. And that's a lot of what I want my residency to be as well. So a lot of it is to unearth these sort of hidden, more oral histories and narratives that kind of get lost in time. I mean, whether or not any of what I just said is true, I think it's still important because it's out there in terms of how we connect with each other. And so I think when I found out, it was like maybe 2 English sources, but some people who understood Chinese were like, yeah, that's true. But I mean, how much can I trust it? I mean, at this point, I feel like it's important to start at least having some of these histories starting, and to have these conversations and at least build these conversations that we don't generally have, and we kind of assume what boba means or what pearl means. So that's a fun tidbit. But enough about me. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the all the contributors in colonial imports. And so we didn't do an open call. We decided, because of a kind of a short turnaround, we decided to just solicit groups of people or people that we thought would be interested, and we asked them to send in a proposal, and there we chose which ones fit the best in terms of each other and how they synergize with each other. So here you'll see a panel of a collaboration between Stephanie Wong Ken and Jarrett Sitter. And so this particular conversation, they talked about a little bit more deeply about, COVID and its impact on their relationship, but also there was also a relation around, but the relationship around Chinatown and also bubble tea, but in a way that's conversational and a bit more candid, which is also the same too with uh, Mia Riley and her sister Sarah Lai. And so on their end, they were also having conversations about bubble tea in Chinatown, but instead they were talking about their distance, in age and in family, and their differences, but yet how bubble tea in Chinatown kind of connect them together in ways that no other places can for them, and what that really means for them. And then there was also Katie Lee, who is a Korean Canadian who grew up in Calgary, who, despite being, Korean, found her mom and herself some connection to Chinatown or a place of solace, and speaking about how, despite the fact that it's not necessarily catered to Koreans, she was able to, find places where she could at least um, be rebellious, run away from her, not run away, but just to escape, right? And then there's also Paul Zhang, who did some illustration, created some fake ads and illustrations on, how the differences between, traditional desserts, things that, you typically might find in older restaurants or older, more traditional desserts, such as dessert soups, and how that has been superseded or kind of just, forgotten because of bubble tea, and having that depiction. And then also there is Snack Witch, also known as Joni Chung, who took the form of recipes, and inside she interspersed it with her memories of growing up in Vancouver, and how certain drink types, she reminisces around how it, you know, brought conflict or closeness to her family as well. And so that is a general overview of the publication. And yeah, so I'm just gonna continue sharing a little bit more about other topics that I've tried to insert into the publication. There was a lot of information that I wanted to put in, but I couldn't, because I have to restrain myself. But I think one important thing that I think needs to be mentioned when you talk about bubble tea is the actual pearl itself and the tea. So here I'm just going to quickly go over, the history of tapioca. So tapioca, which is actually it comes from the cassava root. So it's the starch of the cassava root, which actually what originates from the Brazil region, in South America, or in that sort of Amazonia region. And it was brought over by Europeans to Southeast Asia to be grown. So it wasn't brought. So it was brought in as a cheaper form of sago, which is kind of a palm of the heart. So it's like a really versatile starch that could be used for food, but also used for a lot of construction as well. But it was brought in because it was easier and cheaper and to mass produce versus sago. And so it was brought in specifically in the Philippines and India and the Java region, so like those island areas, to produce cassava. And over time, because it's cheaper than sago, people started to use tapioca instead of sago. as their like main form of starch. And because it was so cheap as well, it became a really staple. It became a staple starch during the many different wars that happened in that region, in the like all of the world wars and then all of the regional colonial wars. So and then from there it became so it became part of like desserts and like savory dishes. And then when so it's said, it was said, not through actual academic means, uh, it was said that it was likely to be have transported northwards through Fujian or Hoikin Chinese merchants who brought it from the southern regions when they were trading upwards to southern China, and also through Vietnam. And so that's probably where and how that route came through to the south of China. And then that became a staple as well in that region. So a lot of Chinese desserts contain tapioca pearls. And so it's likely to have originated that type of dessert from Southeast Asia. And because and then how it got to Taiwan is a lot of Taiwan or Taiwanese Chinese people are from the Hoikin and the Fujian area. So it's likely that when there were merchants settled onto and colonized Taiwan, that island, they brought along that tradition and traditional dessert of consumption. So that's the general history of how tapioca pearls reached that region and how it became a part of bubble tea, and then how it now is back into the Americas, but in a different form, probably not how one would have expected it, the cassava root to have be formed into. And so, and then at some point, I also talked about milk tea. What happened to that slide? Oh, here's the milk tea slide. Okay. And then I just want to do a quick conversation about milk tea because again, bubble tea is basically milk tea and tapioca. One of the interesting things I found during my research around milk tea is that actually, because we like to think that milk tea is like a British thing or a European thing, and that kind of like ruined tea. Well, not ruined tea, but definitely changed the way tea is consumed. But I actually found out that the reason why European royalty and imperial forces thought that drinking tea and milk is the appropriate way of drinking tea is because during the colonial periods, the early colonial periods, China was in their last dynasty, which is it was ruled by the Ming dynasty. Wait, is it Ming dynasty? Oh no. Anyway, so the Qing dynasty. My bad. So the Qing dynasty, for those who know Chinese history, it was actually ruled by the Manchu people, so not the what people would consider to be the native Han people. And so because of that, they actually brought along their tea tradition of drinking tea with milk, specifically buffalo milk. Um, and so they brought along their tradition of drinking milk with tea. And so when the European, when the European colonial forces were part of the royal court, they had thought that this was actually the proper way of drinking tea because at the time too, the Han Chinese, drank what we call clear tea, so it's tea without any other additives or specifically milk. And so they brought along that tradition or that assumption that drinking milk and tea were actually like the civilized way of doing things, and they thought they were doing the appropriate thing. And there's also other oral histories that like some royal person thought that if you put milk into the cup before you pour the tea, it would preserve the porcelain. And there's also another story around how during the Industrial Revolution in the UK, a lot of the factory owners would just put milk in tea because a lot of the times, apparently, they say, the factory workers would take their time drinking, they would take their time in their break because they wanted to, because the tea was hot. So their excuse was, oh, I have to finish this tea before I work, but it's so hot. So they had to like extend the time. And so these are kind of the origin stories of how milk tea came to be. But I think it's interesting though that like actually it may have actually have been a Chinese of sorts history of how milk tea actually became what we kind of know today, but it was just popularized by the imperial and colonial forces, of especially the British Empire. And so, so those are the two really interesting, um, I think, colonial relations of how things have moved around the world. Yeah, so I'm just going to quickly flip through the rest of the publication and my contribution to it. And so I created this guide of like, what are these things? So when people go into bubble tea shops, they can like go in and be like, what is grass jelly and stuff. But because I'm myself, I obviously put a little block of information around where these origins come from, and I took a lot of these information from oral history as well, or written history. Like a lot of these I got from forums, questions people have, and I put them in there, and I also added what it would feel like to eat it or what sort of relation it has. So like a lot of people don't know what grass jelly is. So what I did was I gave a small history of it and then its flavor profile and like mouth feel, just so that, people hopefully feel a bit more comfortable having to order, or at least to try. So maybe they're like, oh, this sounds like something worthwhile trying versus having it be this unknowable thing on a menu that would feel like it's meant for only specific people. Um, and so yeah, so especially like the history of IU jelly, that is definitely just like based on forums. I don't even know if it's true. Like that sounds really not true, but I like how there's a story around this like business guy who just one day was thirsty and then he saw this jelly in a river and then he had his daughter sell it and it became so popular that he named it after her. I mean, is it true? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but I think it's compelling, right? It's compelling that there's these stories that we don't tend to hear that I think is really interesting as well. Also, IU jelly is made really strangely too. So I encourage people to look it up. I don't know if I want to go through every single thing that is interesting because I think everything is interesting all the time. But I'm going to just move on to the rest of my presentation. So as part of the launch of Colonial Imports, we also had a review-a-thon. So we invited a small number of the community to attend our Discord review-a-thon launch where we encourage people to pick their favorite bubble tea, maybe not even their favorite bubble tea place, but a bubble tea place they want to review online, and then post it. And during that event, we would chat with each other about which places we liked and how we liked it. But also, generally speaking, I think people at that time also didn't really have a lot of chances to talk to each other. So even though it was about bubble tea, I think what happened was we just had general conversations that one would normally have around bubble tea. And I thought it was interesting because some of these people I haven't seen in a long time or chatted in a long time, and it was really nice to catch up with them. And so I thought it was like a nice feeling to be like, a online replication of what bubble tea tends to be in person, which is, a way to connect with each other. Even if it's not about bubble tea, it somehow worked out that bubble tea again brought us together and we were able to share and socialize with each other. So I encourage people to like find these online, but also to do it yourself. So I think it's, especially right now, it's important to, encourage people to review because people are looking at reviews more so now than ever of, what are worthwhile places. And especially in these times where, uh, Chinatown and local businesses are definitely not, are probably are struggling, right? Because they're relying on street um, traffic. So I definitely encourage people to do so now or even after this presentation. And then I'll just quickly go through what I actually will do in the residency. So, okay. Uh, so I've been really into the terminology asynchronous and asynchronicity regarding my research. So I'll be bringing that into Chinatown and I will be doing them in what I call maps. So maps as in like mapping of things and then chronicling it and then creating a thing in which it shows like certain points of interest or how people move or yeah, or the ways things have changed. And so the ways I'll be doing it is fourfold. So I will be taking up ad spaces and bulletin boards to have actual maps of sorts, just because, yeah, they're more public. And then I want to create stamping stations around spaces, like around the neighborhood. I'm also going to be creating radio and pocket radio segments. So I've been talking to a couple of local radio stations, one CJSW and the other one the Chinese radio station, to actually produce a segment. So hopefully that will attract that one end of the city, which is CJSW and their community, but definitely way more English oriented, but also hoping to connect with the Chinese community who may or may not actually know about Chinatown, but and that's like a Chinese language. So I'll be working with both of those stations, and that's going to be part of my residency. And then I also want to repurpose a lot of vending machines that is found in Chinatown that are sitting kind of empty, and I want to repopulate them, and have them be filled with specific memories or specific objects that you can find in Chinatown that may be a bit hard to get or a bit intimidating. And I just want to repurpose those because a lot of them are sitting empty because I think, as we all know, they're not as popular these days. And so I want to reuse those. Yeah, and then generally speaking, my intent for the residency is all about really trying to find the actual connection of between people, like why and how is Chinatown continuing to exist? What sort of things drive people to continue or to not work together? So originally I had thought about the word grief, but then, upon further conversations, I think, grief, grief of like missing home or grief of what has been lost, doesn't really entirely fit with what I really wanted to do. So I'm also in a way searching for a word, is it wistfulness? Is it a longing? Is it a continuity? But I think asynchronicity or asynchronous is a word that I think is going to bind my actual research. So the ways in which we all come from different times of places, so some of us are immigrants, first gens, second gens, from different parts of the world, from different cultures, and how we all amalgamate into Chinatown. And so what is it that allows us to be in the spaces together? But also, what is something that is actually commonly found, amongst all of these people and all of these times. And these are some of the words that I have come up with currently that I'll be working towards for the research and how I approach as well people and the research I do. And yeah, so I'll just end there. And yeah, thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Theresa. I think Jazz is going to maybe pull us all back on the screen now, Annie, Cheryl, and Theresa. Wow. As Annie was saying earlier, it's really exciting to just, it's been a while. It's been a while since we connected in person, and we've been connecting asynchronously via email or occasional Zoom calls over the past year. And folks have been working on these ancillary projects throughout that time. But it's really, really exciting as we get closer to the date to be able to really start to visualize how your research is taking form and the directions your research has gone. So we have a couple questions. We're gonna have a little bit of a discussion as a group, but I encourage you all, we'll open it up to a Q&A to the audiences as well. So go ahead and feel free to pop questions in the Q&A as Jazz suggested at your leisure, but we'll get started, we'll get rolling with the conversation over on our end here. And really what I was excited to jump off with was that last time we were all physically together, and thinking back to that introductory program week in Calgary, Chinatown. What were some of the themes that resonated with each of you or struck you as distinct from other Chinatowns that you're familiar with? Interestingly, yesterday at the opening panel, we had a very similar question from one of the audience members. And given your geographical variance amongst the three of you, I'd be very curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
I guess I could go first if that's okay. I think even though I'm local, I think one of the things that kind of struck me as somehow odd, but also not odd, was that we don't actually have a gate in our city. So, and I think that's something that often is not mentioned. And I think that's a pretty distinct Calgary Chinatown thing. So even though we have a actual community dedicated as and designated as Chinatown, unlike a lot of other Chinatowns in Canada, there is no gate. So so I just wanted to start with that.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
New York doesn't really have a gate either. There's like a pavilion, but there's not really a gate. I think in terms of what struck me from Calgary's Chinatown is it's a small Chinatown. It's like, 6 blocks, but it's got such a strong community. I think there's also a lot of support for the elderly in a way that I haven't really seen in the same way. I think via the associations where seniors go to socialize, but also via the senior housing. There's so much senior housing that's built for the aging Chinatown community. And I think it's really amazing that there is this infrastructure to take care of the elderly. In my research on ground, I think some of the buildings were also like designed and built in the late 70s. So really there was like even decades ago, all this foresight to try to take care of Chinatown's elders. I think that's really amazing.
and that's one of the it's not a gate to the community, but we do have a gate to the Elderly Citizens Association for one of those buildings you're talking about, Cheryl, that takes you across the little path. It's called a moon gate, I believe. That's just right on the sidewalk that takes you to their building, which is not the same, but an interesting conversation and piece to note, especially coming off of Aya's presentation and the removal of the Harbin Gate in Edmonton, Chinatown. Annie, did you have anything that struck you as particularly compelling?
Just to echo what was already said, I really appreciate the political community and the history of political activism that continues to resonate with the neighborhood there, and even with the younger generation. I find that really inspiring and quite distinct.
I'm just going to add one more thing. And I think just thinking about, Theresa, your work and interest in food and these kind of networks, I think something that struck me in the time that I was like living in Calgary is thinking about the availability of vegetables and fruits. Like I was observing the produce that was available in Calgary, or rather the Asian produce available at the Chinese supermarket. A lot of things were plastic wrapped to keep fresh, and I was just sort of wondering where they came from. And like for me, obviously the Chinatowns I have the most familiarity with are New York's Chinatown, where I live, and LA's Chinatown, because I grew up in LA and would always go there with my parents. So if I were to create this like spectrum of abundance of produce, I'd have like New York on one end and Calgary in the middle and LA on the other. And maybe because I'm spoiled in New York City, there's so much abundant produce year round. Like literally it's snowing, there's vendors selling what's seasonal, like on the street. In the blistering sun, they're selling amazing fruit. So it's supplied apparently by this really robust network of Asian growers on the East Coast. And it gets brought into the city several times a day. Vendors sell what's there. It's just, there's such an abundant supply. And in LA, ironically, even though California is the heart of so much rich farmland and grows such a big variety of produce, LA's Chinatown doesn't reflect that at all. It's been like super hard hit by gentrification. And I know the business improvement district, the bid isn't necessarily like trying to do anything to preserve the Chinatown. So last year, I think it was last year or early this year, the last supermarket with fresh Asian produce was just forced to close down. So again, I think that's something interesting, but maybe in terms of like Calgary, like finding out like, where is all this Asian produce coming from?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. It was an unfortunate reality during COVID that I don't know if you all recall JK Produce, which was the outdoor fruit market right by the National League. It's where we got all of our fruit for breakfast every morning during the program week. It's also where we got all the fruit when we were gifting all the tongs and the associations on our visits. And they unfortunately closed this past year. And they were someplace that, I know I frequented after work or on my way home if I needed something quick, fruit and veg. But they're one of the few kind of outdoor, year-round outdoor vendors. We have the aunties on that sidewalk as well that come out in the nice weather. But really, even in the middle of winter, if we had a nice warm Chinook day, they'd be out there. But I wonder if there's a question as well about our population size in Calgary and in terms of, and I've always found moving from a more southern geography to Calgary that there's a much different kind of quality and scope of fruit that I noticed when I moved up here, which I'm not sure if that has much to do with it, but I'd be curious to hear from our longtime Canadians on the panel if they have any thoughts about that.
I will say though, as a native Calgarian, we just have a unfortunate lack of good network for specific kinds of fruits and vegetables. So if it's not something that could be grown or easily imported from, say, BC or something like that, it's quite hard to get to because, especially if it requires time, if it's like sensitive, like it needs to be ripe a certain amount of time. So I think not just Asian type of vegetables, fruits and vegetables, it's just fruits and vegetables, I think in general is quite difficult to be reached to Calgary. Because I think we're big-ish, but not big enough. That's always that problem that we always have in Calgary. So a lot of the times is we have enough people for something to exist, but not enough for it to be flourishing and robust and diverse. Yeah.
And Annie, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna quickly answer Gerald's question. There is TNT in BC and Alberta, but I keep being reminded that the TNT in Calgary is not as good as the ones in Vancouver. So take that what you will, and I probably agree.
I find it pretty good, but I also feel spoiled just having one close, like such a large grocer close to me that I can go regularly. I did not grow up with that option. Annie, I see here, I know and apologies to everyone. I know that our last panel ran overtime a bit and we got pushed back. And Annie, of course, when you need to head out, we totally understand. I know that you had a peek at some of these questions. I don't know if any of them particularly resonated with you that you might want to respond to. I can also just read out the next one. It's very much about the state of the world over the past year, but I do want to give you a chance before you have to head out if you wanted to say any last words or if you wanted to respond to a specific question.
I can hang out for 10 more minutes. Okay.
Great. Okay, well, maybe we'll chat a little bit about then the pandemic, and we know that that's caused significant upheaval across the world, particularly in communities of color such as Chinatowns, and for folks of the Asian diaspora very broadly. It's also pushed back residencies for Theresa and Annie and split Cheryl's residency in two. It's added a virtual and long distance element for each of you. How have these significant shifts impacted your practice and the focus of your work? Anyone in particular want to take the first go at it?
Well, I think in my case, I think I've, it's obviously it's a little bit of a different situation. I think I've been grateful just to have spent the first 2 months of my residency in Calgary last year, pre-pandemic. I think for me and my project, it was really important and crucial to be walking around, talking to people, sharing meals together. And so the work I'm doing now on the project is really processing all of this this research, which can be done virtually quite easily. But I think in terms of the pandemic, it hasn't really so much affected the focus of my residency. It's really more sparked several satellite projects and events around this idea of collective Chinatown resilience. And I've definitely been bringing people into these projects that I met in Calgary, Chinatown, or through this residency, like Annie participated in the resilience talk. Carol Poon and some of these other, and Tony Wong and these other amazing people in Calgary are participating and submitting for the Musings from Chinatown publication. So for me, it's been really great to see these new friends being connected with my local New York Chinatown contacts into these broader discussions.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's the same for me. I think it's the content itself hasn't quite changed. I think it's just approach, right? It's like, because originally I was thinking of, I like holding tours. I like holding tours of things. And so, you know, it's a little bit harder to do physical tours, and especially because I didn't want to do just a Chinatown tour. I wanted to do tours specific to you know, again, kind of like the bubble thief, you know, specific to specific things that you find in Chinatown, and then talking about the history or the possible futures of how these specific things in Chinatown can and can't be. So, you know, like for example, there is a lot of murals in Calgary's Chinatown, which is both a, you know, something that some people really like, but also a bit of a point that a lot of Calgarians sometimes like to make fun of Chinatown. You know, it's parking lots and now a bunch of murals. And so, you know, but there's a lot of misconceptions around that, right? So I had been interested in, you know, physically being in these spaces and then talking about it and taking tours and being like, you know, sure, they're like parking lots, but there's a lot of history and also potential, you know, in these spaces that isn't being talked about. So that was essentially what I wanted to do in my residency, but now I can't quite do that. I mean, I might still do that, but you know, but instead of doing that, I also figured too, especially from the pandemic, I think people are feeling isolated and unable to connect. So instead of me trying to fit what I wanted to fit, originally I decided to expand outwards, which is how, yeah, talking to radio stations and creating radio segments for different languages and different communities kind of came from. And also having these spaces where people can just go to you know, randomly or on their own and on their own time, and that isn't pressured. Because I know that community engagement also there's a lot of pressure to like attend, right, or a lot of fear and anxiety of not being able to attend. So, so I think a part of that too is like wanting people who are just out to just stumble upon or to go at their own pace, such as like the vending machines, because a lot of these are owned and run by bakeries especially, and you know, so people are going to see it. So but instead of, you know, just being sitting there, I want people to like, you know, go back to it again. And you know, so that's kind of how it's changed, and thinking about connection, you know, thinking about what are things that people often are connected with but aren't quite actually familiar with or not quite aware that they're connected to each other. And so that's kind of how I have shifted my residency.
I think my residency shifted dramatically. One, you know, because I'm like Theresa, I'm not in Calgary, and I'm like Cheryl. I didn't start before. Can you hear me? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
a little, yeah.
So initially, I think Theresa and I we were going to collaborate on doing a night market and exploring Chinatown, Calgary as the first sort of night scene in the city, and then of course that could no longer happen. But I did also maintain from my first proposal the idea of the cultural exchange program, and it shifted. I think in a good way to focus mostly on cultural safety and thinking about anti-ship and thinking more deeply and intently about the future of Chinatown as an anti-colonial space for allyship. So, and this time, this whole year in the pandemic has given me that space to think more intently and to shape my residency around this new direction. So, I would say it was not yeah, dramatic change, but not that big of a departure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, it's interesting, especially for Theresa and Annie. I'm just thinking about both of those ending comments, and with Annie, with the Pink Flamingo mural by Jay Sterling, that intersection happening on the site of the Aboriginal Friendship Center was is a crux of that idea of cultural exchange. And it's been really, really interesting to see how you've followed those conversations, reached out to Jay and brought the conversation of Black Lives Matter and these again, rhetoric, really harmful rhetoric, trying to pit different communities of color against one another to instead turn that narrative on its head, and talk about how we have to support one another, and that's the only way that we're going to overcome white supremacy. And on a slightly less serious note, Theresa, with the vending machines, I was just at Rainbow Bakery last week or the week before, and typically everyone crowds into the bakeries all at once, trying to like get the last type of bun before it's gone. But with COVID measures, you're waiting patiently outside the door in the hallway of Dragon City Mall in this case, and it's the perfect opportunity to stumble upon something. There's time, there's the kind of hustle and bustle and movement. There's been these commas that have been situated throughout the community because you're waiting outside of these spaces for your turn to enter, respectfully taking time. There was a comment actually in the Bubble Tea publication, one of the, I believe it was Ariam's review of Try Again, where she talks about the care they take sanitizing each customer between for them, like actually spraying it for them with like this beautiful scented sanitizer. And there's more time that's been built into all of these interactions in Calgary Chinatown, which I think is going to be a really, really interesting aspect of the interactions that you all have.
And that is, yeah, I think the comma point I think is really good. Like I want to be that comma, right? That pause between our lives or our thoughts that we have. Because I think a lot of times when we talk about Chinatown, we also talk about things not abstractly, but in these broad schemes that's kind of hard to envision ourselves as people, right? So part of what I want to do is bring that back, even though we're always engulfed in these sort of political, socio-political, and economic as well forces. It's like how do we actually exist in these spaces? And that's exactly what I intend to do, and I hope people will find also some solace or at least some joy in seeing those things. Yeah. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, well, and I think that these pauses have also given folks an opportunity, just reflecting on the themes from the weekend and the content from the weekend and the work Cheryl was doing with the resiliency series and bringing all of these different contributors from various Chinatowns together. There's been time to connect and take collective action and to move forward on some of these conversations that have, really critically needed to happen. And that's exciting. It's exciting to have that momentum. So I'm aware that we're getting a little over time. I'm wondering if you all would like to, I see one question in the Q&A. I'm wondering if you all would like to answer that and skip some of the other questions we had discussed.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, just so we have a chance to answer them. So this is from Anonymous. And the question is, do you find it difficult to navigate these conversations in a place as conservative as quote unquote Calgary, also known as Mohkinstsis?
Can we specify these conversations, like what we've talked about a lot today. So I'm just like, what part, like, which part are we?
I guess I could start because what I'm going to be talking about is more than just, I guess, well, I mean, it's based on life experience, right? So maybe I could start and then hopefully both of you can riff off of those if that works. So for me, I generally find the answer is it's actually quite difficult. And so I don't know if it's specifically to Calgary because I haven't had that much experience outside of Calgary, but from my experience, being native here is, or not native, but having grown up here, is that there's like this one layer of generally not talking about things that a lot of Chinese communities tend to have, especially for things that are traumatic or difficult. So you tend to not speak about these things anyway. And I think you can see that in how the general Chinese community is responding to the Asian hate, right? The anti-Asian hate that has been happening. And so just based on my conversations with friends is that it's like people are aware, but they're not really talking about it in a way that a lot of different communities are talking about it, right? They're not sharing their anxieties as openly. They're not talking about the actual microaggressions and the ways that they have been had to internalize a lot of these issues. And so I think there's that layer, and then there's like a layer of conservatism in Calgary. And that I think also has to do with the lack of density, right? A lack of, compared to other cities like, say, Vancouver, there's enough people that people can kind of create their own communities and bubbles, and that helps to create diversity. Whereas in Calgary, you kind of tend to find people kind of gravitate towards a type of thinking or not thinking, but just it's easier for them to have to gravitate to each other or to not. And so there's a lot of these different bubbles that I find to be quite hard to navigate. And so, there was a talk of BIA earlier. So there is, the BIA version in Calgary that I think is typical of most BIAs in Canada. But so that's like there's also these other associations that are also quite conservative too, right? And as to whether or not it's based because it's in Calgary or Alberta or otherwise, it's they aren't as open to conversations that we had learned from our programming week. Like a lot of them aren't open for people to just enter and have a conversation or see their space. And so, even though we are interested in learning about, them and their association and their history, they are closed off. And I find that to be quite typical in Calgary, especially in the Chinese community. So there's this tendency to not share anything unless there's they're really skeptical. So when I was talking to the radio station, Fairchild radio station, they're a commercial radio station, but there was there's some need to prove themselves to me that they are. No worries. Do you want to say something before you go though?
I
No,
was
I can stop talking. I can talk forever, so you can talk if you want.
If anyone has any questions directly for me, you can ask me directly, I guess, I don't know, the new gallery can send me an email or something, or just follow me on Instagram. But thank you so much. This was such an amazing conference, an amazing panel. I'm so sorry I have to leave. But,
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Annie.
Bye,
Really
Annie.
appreciate you here. Yeah, and I think that this will be the last question because I do know that they will have closing remarks still. So we'll just get both of your responses on this, and then we'll pass it off to Lisa and the team at Griffin Art Projects.
Yeah, and then so I guess I'll just end it off by saying I find it quite hard, and I think language is also not helping. So yeah, and I think there's a lot of trauma though around language. So I think having to overcome that and to make people to trust you and myself and others that we're not going to take advantage of them or to re-traumatize them, I think is quite a big hurdle. And again, I don't know if it's specific to Calgary, but that's kind of what I've observed. But
Yeah, I think that's interesting to hear. I mean, obviously, we come from very different levels of experience with the Calgary Chinatown community, and you're from Calgary, and you sort of have a much deeper experience and understanding of the dynamics there. I mean, for me, I, in a way, was a visitor in the community, and I guess so for me, with at least I can speak broadly about the work I was doing, and I feel like, and perhaps it was my process in terms of speaking one-on-one with people often, because I feel like that's a really intimate way to talk to people and to have stories be shared and to have people open up. So for me, in my experience, I did have a lot of really open conversations about racism in Chinatown, or about growing up, feeling like an outsider there, or, XYZ, or even other, feuds with other Chinatown groups. So I don't know. I mean, for me, again, my experience, I felt like it wasn't like people were closed off or they were difficult conversations to have. I mean, they're always difficult conversations to have, but people were open to having them at that point. I mean, if, you know, zooming out from a more macroscopic perspective of talking about, you know, bigger issues like South Asian hate and all this stuff, like, I am curious what's happening in Calgary, because in New York, everyone has become so vocal. There's been rallies going on every week. Everyone's saying things on social media. There's signs everywhere. And I will just have to say that I have to go in probably a couple of minutes because it is getting dark in New York, and I love New York and I've always felt safe here, but in this era, I don't feel as safe. So I need to leave my studio and get home soon. So I'll just put that out there.
No, of course. And we want you to get home safe, Cheryl. So I think maybe we can continue the conversation then perhaps in the chat and choose for those who are able to stay for the more informal part of the evening. I'm sure there's lots of folks on the call who can speak to the various actions or lack of action that is happening in our different hubs. But I want to thank you both and Annie as well so much for your time today and for sharing the work that you're working on. For everyone listening in here, we will have the residency resuming in May, and so please stay tuned. If you're not signed up for our e-newsletter, that's a great way to stay in touch. Visit our website. We're on social media for the new gallery. And also a big thanks to Jazz for the amazing conference organization all weekend, keeping us going, and to Lisa, of course, and the whole Griffin Arts Projects team. We'll say our goodbye and pass it off to Lisa now. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sue. And a huge thanks to all the panelists. Just quickly before I pass it off to Lisa, I'm just going to type that chat and choose link in the chat one more time, because we would love to keep this conversation going. We've set up a Zoom meeting where we'll be able to actually meet and have more intimate conversations with audience members. So definitely click that link and we'd love to see you. And I'll pass it over to Griffin's director, Lisa Baldessera.
Thank you so much, Jazz. And thank you so much to everyone. I'll keep it very short. It's been such a stimulating and amazing weekend, and everything from looking at, you know, the white-centered urban planning, the economics that are driving these policies, to the activism and analysis of bubble tea. It's just been an amazing weekend. I would say a couple of quotes that I would keep with me would be Cindy Chan Piper's "Messy is okay." Such an amazing way to frame vibrancy in a community and what that looks like. And Doris Chow's urging of noisy and joyous space as political activism. Thank you both so much. And thanks to all of our inspiring speakers this weekend, all the presentations. I know that we're all just buzzing with the layeredness and the nuances and complexity and thoughtfulness. So thank you all so much. I just would like to say an immense thank you as well to the partners, our collaborative partners, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Center A, and the New Gallery. You've just been fabulous to work with. Thank you so much for the thoughtfulness that you brought in preparation for this project. I'd also like to thank some of our supporters, Canada Council for the Arts, that has provided project support to this series of public programs, including the conference, to BC Arts Council, to North Vancouver Recreation and Culture, and also in support of the exhibition, Richmond Art Gallery, the Ryerson University Faculty of Communication and Design, the Museum of Toronto, and also Canadian Heritage for the support of our Young Canada internship. I'd also like to thank our endorsers and collaborative supporters for the weekend's conference. Youth Collaborative for Chinatown, who shared with us today. Youth Collaborative for Chinatown practices, shares, and celebrates the living culture and heritage of Vancouver's Chinatown. As a registered nonprofit, they gratefully accept donations as Vancouver Chinatown Generation Society. Because of the disproportionate impact on Chinatown businesses during COVID, donations will be used to purchase gift certificates from local restaurants and grocery stores, which will then be distributed to low-income seniors. And Jazz is providing that link in the chat. Also, AIA, an intergenerational group of artists that we heard from today, and Chinatown community members who are using the tools of art and culture to make work that addresses the displacement and cultural erasure in Edmonton's Chinatown. While AEA does not accept donations, they always love to meet people who care about Edmonton's Chinatown and want to be part of the work. We'd also like to thank T-Base, who you heard from today, a curious community art space tucked away in Toronto's Chinatown Centre Mall. They aim to make accessible space for intergenerational activists and artists who support social justice movements in and around Chinatown. T-Base accepts donations, and Jazz has also provided the link in the chat. And thank you so much for your help in promoting this conference and for your help in facilitating the chat and choose and all the supportive promotions of this event. I'd also like to thank the Griffin staff and volunteers, Liam Neal, Marina Zekova, our gallery manager, Brittany Gordelars, Nathaniel Marchand, our Young Canada Works intern who worked on the project, as well as a huge thanks to Jazz Keeler, our contract virtual programs coordinator, for all of her work in preparation. I think the reason it was so seamless was because of all of that work in preparation. So this is a huge thanks to Jazz Keeler. And I also want to thank our amazing curator, Theresa Tam, who guest curated the exhibition that began this project, Who's Chinatown? Examining Chinatown Gazes in Art, Archives, and Collections. It has been such an honor to work with Karen, as always. And I am just going to hand it off to Karen for a few words. And thank you so much, Karen, for all of your thoughtfulness in coordinating this program and thinking through all of the nuances that has made such an amazing weekend. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, I'm going to keep this short too, because I'd like to, start the chat and choose. But what an amazing weekend. I'm just going to echo everybody's remarks that it was just so incredible to hear, all about these amazing projects you are all doing and working on the work that you're all doing, and just thinking about all the different various ideas and models of how we can engage with community, the various types of activism, art as activism, and engagement. And so, yeah, my big thanks to all our panelists, the moderators, the partners and supporters for this conference, and as well as to Lisa in the Griffin team for your support this past more than a year while working on the exhibition project, but also in developing the public program together and collaborating on that. And biggest thanks to Jazz for just all the amazing work that you've done this past year on all the public programming and organizing the conference, and again making it just breeze so amazingly. Just sorry, I'm at a loss for words. It's just and thank you all for
thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
I'm going to hop on here to add my thank you. It's been an amazing, incredible weekend, and just a huge thanks to all of our partners. What a joy it's been to work with everyone and all of our presenters and moderators and amazing audience members as well for your amazing questions and participation. So I'm going to go ahead and put that link once again in the chat because I'd love to see everyone at the chat and choose. Okay, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jazz. Thank you so much.